A small silver or gray car parked deep in a misty, rain-soaked forest at night. The windshield is streaked with rain, and the forest is dimly lit by early dawn light breaking through heavy clouds. Just outside the driver's side window, barely visible in the mist and shadows, stands a tall, grotesquely thin humanoid figure. It has no face, just a smooth, pale surface, and its proportions are slightly off. Arms too long, head angled unnaturally. The figure wears a light blue rain jacket that seems clean and dry despite the storm. The forest around is silent and wet, with fog curling between tree trunks and the ground muddy from a night of relentless rain. The atmosphere should feel claustrophobic, unsettling, and haunted by something unnatural yet eerily still. Have you ever felt that the darkness isn't empty? That it's filled with something watching, waiting, assessing? I never used to think about such things. Not until that night at Elk Rock State Park in central Iowa, when I learned that sometimes the forest doesn't want you to leave. I should mention that I'm a geological surveyor by profession. I spend most of my working life outdoors, mapping terrain, collecting soil samples, and generally enjoying the solitude that comes with the job. After 15 years in the field, I'd grown comfortable with the isolation, even fond of it. The quiet places of the world had always felt safer to me than crowded cities. How terribly wrong I was. It was early November last year, unseasonably warm for Iowa. I was conducting a routine survey near Elk Rock, cataloging some interesting limestone formations along the Des Moines River. The work itself was meant to take 3 days, and rather than commute from a hotel in Knoxville, I decided to camp on site. The park was practically deserted that time of year, most tourists having packed up after the autumn colors peaked in October. My first 2 days were productive and utterly unremarkable. The weather was cooperative, the landscape picturesque in that subdued, late autumn way. Barren trees, copper-colored undergrowth, the slow, dark waters of the river, winding through it all. I'd set up camp in a small clearing about half a mile from the nearest marked trail. Not strictly permitted, perhaps, but common practice among seasoned field workers like myself. On the 3rd day, the weather changed. The morning dawned gray and oppressive, the air heavy with the promise of rain. By noon, a light drizzle had begun, and the forecast on my weather radio warned of a significant system moving in overnight. I considered packing up early, but I needed just a few more samples to complete my assignment. So I worked through the drizzle, telling myself I'd be finished and on my way before the real downpour began. I was wrong about that, too. By late afternoon, the drizzle had transformed into a steady, soaking rain, the kind that seems to come from all directions at once, finding its way under collars and into boots no matter how well you're dressed for it. I finally admitted defeat around 5 o'clock, hurrying back to my campsite as the daylight began to fade. The path I'd been using, really just a game trail that I'd widened slightly with my frequent passages, seemed different somehow, longer, the trees crowding closer than I remembered. Twice I had to stop and consult my GPS to confirm I was still heading in the right direction. I blamed it on the rain, on the rapidly diminishing light, on my own fatigue. It wasn't until I was perhaps a quarter mile from my camp that I first noticed the silence. Iowa forests in autumn are not silent places. Even in rain, there should be sounds. The scuttle of small creatures in the underbrush, the calls of birds settling in for the evening, the drone of insects that remain active until the first hard frost. But there was nothing, just the patter of rain on leaves and the squelch of my boots in the mud. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I quickened my pace, no longer caring about the mud spatter in my trousers or the branches that whipped across my face as I pushed through the undergrowth. Something was wrong. I couldn't articulate what exactly, but some ancient part of my brain, the part that knows when predator is near, was screaming at me to run. I broke into my campsite clearing at a near sprint, chest heaving, hair plastered to my forehead from the rain. Everything was as I had left it. Tent still standing, equipment stored under a tarp, nothing disturbed. And yet, the feeling remained. The terrible, creeping certainty that I was not alone. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line that encircled my small camp. The rain had intensified, falling in gray sheets that limited visibility to perhaps 20 yards. Beyond that was shadow, and within that shadow, nothing. I saw nothing, but I felt it all the same. A presence, a consciousness, many consciousnesses, perhaps all focused on me with terrible, patient interest. "Hello," I called, feeling slightly ridiculous even as the word left my mouth. "Is someone there?" The rain answered, drumming against the leaves. Nothing else. I told myself I was being foolish, that isolation and poor weather can play tricks on the mind, that I was a professional, a man of science, not some jumpy teenager around campfire. Still, I decided to leave, to pack up, hike back to my car, and drive to Knoxville. I could get a room for the night, and return in the morning to collect the last of my samples if the weather cleared. I began to disassemble my camp, starting with the small cooking setup I'd established under the tarp. As I was throwing my portable stove, I heard a sound so out of place that at first I couldn't process what I was hearing. Humming, a tune I almost recognized, something old and lilting, like a folk song from another century. It was coming from the trees to the east of my clearing, barely audible over the rain. "Who's there?" I called again, louder this time, anger beginning to replace my initial unease. If someone was playing games, watching me from the woods, I wanted it to stop. "This is a private survey. Please identify yourself." The humming stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was only the rain again. Then a voice, soft female, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "Are you leaving?" I spun toward the sound, peering into the gloom. I could just make out a figure standing among the trees, partially obscured by the trunk of a large oak. A woman, I thought, though it was difficult to be sure in the fading light and the rain. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "The weather's turning. Not a good night to be in the woods." The figure shifted slightly, and for a moment, I caught a clearer glimpse. A pale face, long dark hair hanging in wet strands. She was wearing what looked like a white dress, entirely inappropriate for the weather and the location. "You shouldn't go," she said. Her voice was clearer now, though she hadn't moved closer. "Not safe on the roads in weather like this." There was something reasonable in her argument. The roads around Elk Rock are winding, poorly lit, and would indeed be treacherous in heavy rain. "And yet, I'll manage," I said, returning to my packing with renewed urgency. "Thank you for your concern." "At least wait until morning," she insisted. "The storm will pass by then." I didn't answer, focusing instead on collapsing my tent. My hands were shaking. I noticed distantly. Why were my hands shaking? "Where will you go?" she asked after a moment. She still hadn't moved from her position by the oak, still half hidden. "Knoxville? Pella?" A pause. "Home to Sarah and the boys in Des Moines?" I froze. Tent pole clutched in my suddenly bloodless fingers. I don't have a wife named Sarah. I don't have any children. But my mother's name was Sarah, and she had 3 sons, myself and my 2 brothers. My mother who had died, along with my brothers, 20 years ago in a car accident during a rainstorm while driving home from a camping trip in this very park. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I knew she couldn't possibly have heard me over the rain. But she answered all the same. "Don't you recognize me, Thomas? It's been so long, I know, but surely a boy doesn't forget his own mother." The tent pole slipped from my numb fingers. The woman, the thing pretending to be a woman, stepped slightly away from the tree, and I caught a clearer glimpse of her face. It wasn't my mother. It didn't even really look human, not if you looked closely. The proportions were wrong. Eyes too widely spaced, mouth too small, skin too smooth and uniform, like a doll's. But it was trying to look like her. God help me! It was trying to look like her. "You're not real," I said, my voice hoarse. "You're not her." "Don't be silly, Thomas," the thing said, taking another step forward. Its movements were wrong, too jerky, mechanical, as if it wasn't used to operating the body or. "Of course it's me. I've been waiting for you to come back." We all have. As if on cue, two smaller figures emerged from the trees, flanking the woman thing. They were child-sized, with the same two smooth features, the same jerky movements. My brothers, or things wearing crude approximations of their faces. "We missed you, Tommy," one of them said in a high, piping voice that made my skin crawl. "Why didn't you come with us that day? Why weren't you in the car?" I had been sick that day, a stomach bug. I'd stayed home while they went on the camping trip I'd been looking forward to for months. I'd been so disappointed, so envious of my brothers. And then they never came home. "You're not them," I repeated, backing away slowly. "You're not my family. But we could be together now," the mother thing said, its voice distorting slightly, as if multiple voices were speaking in perfect unison. "All of us. Forever." It held out a hand, too long, the fingers too tapered, like white branches reaching toward me. Behind it, the smaller figures began to change, their outlines blurring, limbs elongating. I ran. I abandoned everything. Tent, equipment, the samples I'd spent days collecting. I ran blindly through the forest, no longer concerned with paths or direction, driven only by the primal need to escape. Behind me, I heard them calling. Not just three voices now, but many, a chorus of different tones and timbres, all calling my name, all asking me to stop, to wait, to come back to them. The rain was a solid wall now, reducing visibility to mere feet. I stumbled over roots, crashed through bushes, brambles tearing at my clothes and skin. I lost all sense of direction, of time. I might have run for minutes or hours. Somewhere in that desperate flight, I became aware of the trees. They were wrong, twisted in ways that trees shouldn't be able to twist, bent toward me as I passed, as if straining to reach out, to grab, to hold. And there were faces in the bark, not the innocent pareidolia of knots and whirls that sometimes look like eyes or mouths, but actual faces, screaming faces, pleading faces, watching faces. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to buckle, and then miraculously I saw lights ahead, the orange glow of sodium lamps. The car park. My car. I stumbled the last 100 yards, the voices behind me growing more urgent, more angry. The trees seemed to close in, branches reaching like grasping hands. One snagged my jacket, tearing the sleeve. Another lashed across my face, leaving a stinging welt. But then I was there, fumbling with numb fingers for my keys, yanking open the car door. throwing myself inside. I locked the doors with a frantic jab of my thumb and sat there, gasping for breath, dripping rainwater onto the upholstery. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the rain hammering on the roof and my own ragged breathing. Then, slowly, I became aware of movement at the edge of the car park. Figures standing just beyond the reach of the lamps, partially obscured by the curtain of rain. Dozens of them, all shapes and sizes, all watching. I started the engine with shaking hands and threw the car into reverse. As I backed out of space, my headlights swept across the tree line, illuminating the watchers for a split second. They weren't human. They had never been human. What I had taken for people were actually something else, something that wore humanity like ill-fitting clothes. Their faces were blank, featureless expanses of pale flesh, save for crude approximations of eyes and mouths that looked more like tears in fabric than actual features. And they were coming forward now, moving with that same jerky, puppet-like motion, closing the distance between the trees and my car. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed the accelerator, the car fishtailing on the wet surface before gaining traction. I took the winding exit road at dangerous speed, certain that at any moment a tree would fall across my path, or one of those things would appear in the middle of the road. Neither happened. I reached the main highway without incident, and only when I saw the lights of Knoxville in the distance did I begin to breathe normally again. I never reported what happened. What would I say? That the forest was full of shape-shifting entities that could read minds, that wore the faces of the dead, that the trees themselves were alive and hostile? I'd have been sectioned. Instead, I quit my job, moved to Chicago, found work that keeps me firmly in urban environments, surrounded by concrete and glass and the comforting hum of millions of people. But I dream of Elk Rock, of the watching woods, of the things with the faces of my dead family, still waiting for me to return. And sometimes when it rains heavily, I imagine I hear humming, that same old tune, almost but not quite familiar. I never camp anymore, never hike. I avoid parks and nature reserves and any place where trees grow in significant numbers. Most people think it's odd, this aversion. Those who know me better assume it's trauma from that night. Perhaps I was attacked, they speculate, or had some other frightening experience in the wild. They're right in their way, but they don't understand the true nature of what waits in the forests of Iowa, what has perhaps always waited there in the spaces between trees, in the shadows beneath the leaves. They don't understand that the woods are hungry, and the woods remember. Are you listening to this in the rain? Do you hear anything beneath that steady patter? A humming, perhaps? A voice calling your name? Don't answer. Don't ever answer. And if you must walk in the woods, remember you're never really alone, and the trees are always watching. Have you ever been camping in Iowa? The real Iowa, not the tourist spots, but the deep woods where the canopy is so thick that even at midday, the sunlight struggles to reach the forest floor? I have, and I'd give anything to forget what happened to me there. It was late October, just over a year ago now. I'm a wildlife photographer by trade, which means I spend most of my life chasing perfect moments in imperfect places. The autumn colors in Iowa's woodlands are a bit of a hidden gem, you see. While everyone flocks to New England for their fall foliage fix, the Midwest offers its own splendid display, without the crowds. I'd been planning this particular trip for months. 3 days in Backbone State Park, followed by a more adventurous expedition into some less trodden areas near the Yellow River State Forest. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies, But as is often the case in Iowa during autumn, the weather had ideas of its own. My first 2 days in Backbone were uneventful. Pleasant, even. I captured some lovely shots of maple trees ablaze with crimson and gold, a family of deer grazing in the misty morning light, that sort of thing. But I was after something more raw, more untouched. So on the 3rd day, I packed up my modest campsite and drove northeast toward a section of woodland that a local guide had tipped me off about. Not officially part of the state forest, he'd said, but connected to it. Fewer rangers, fewer trails, better shots. He'd marked a spot on my map where there was supposedly an old logging road that would take me in deep enough to find the kind of pristine wilderness I was after. The drive took about 2 hours, and by the time I reached the unmarked turnoff, the afternoon was already surrendering to evening. The sky had darkened considerably, not just with the approach of nightfall, but with the gathering of dense, charcoal-gray clouds that promised a proper downpour. I should have turned back then. Any sensible person would have. But I've never been accused of having an excess of sense, especially when there's a photograph to be had. The logging road was barely deserving of the name. More a suggestion of a path where trees were slightly less numerous. My old Subaru handled it better than most cars would have. But even so, I had to crawl along at a walking pace, wincing at every scrape of branch against paintwork. About 3 miles in, the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against my windscreen. Within minutes, it was a deluge. The sound of it drumming against the roof of my car was almost deafening, and visibility dropped to nearly nothing. I had no choice but to stop driving. I pulled over as best I could, half on what passed the road, half nestled between 2 large elms, according to my map and GPS. I was still at least a mile from the clearing where I'd planned to make camp. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and daylight was fading fast. You've really done it this time, haven't you? I muttered to myself, watching the windscreen wipers fight a losing battle against the torrent. I decided to wait it out. I had supplies, food, water, a sleeping bag. If necessary, I could spend the night in the car and continue to my intended campsite in the morning. So I switched off the engine to save fuel, leaving just the battery on so I could charge my phone and camera batteries. The rain continued, somehow growing even heavier as darkness fell completely. Without the headlights, the world outside my windows was an impenetrable wall of black. I used my torch to check my map one more time, confirming that I was indeed in the middle of nowhere. No ranger stations, no campgrounds, no other access roads for miles. It was strangely peaceful in its way. The rhythmic percussion of raindrops, the occasional rumble of distant thunder, the absolute isolation. I made myself a cold dinner of trail mix and beef jerky, took a few sips from my water bottle, and settled in to edit some photos on my laptop. I must have nodded off at some point, because I woke with a start to a change in the sound of the rain. It was still coming down heavily, but there was a new noise alongside it, a repetitive squelching like footsteps in mud, circling my car. My first thought was wildlife, perhaps a deer or even a black bear, curious about the strange metal intrusion in their domain. I fumbled for my torch, reasoning that the light would likely scare off whatever it was. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating sheets of rain and the dense wall of trees and underbrush surrounding my car. I saw nothing at first, but as I played the light in a slow circle around the vehicle, I caught a flash of something pale moving quickly behind a tree trunk. Too tall for a deer, too upright for a bear. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. "Is someone there?" No response, save for the continued patter of rain, and another squelch of footsteps, now on the other side of my car. I told myself it was nothing, a fellow hiker, perhaps caught in the same storm, or my imagination, fueled by too many hours alone in the dark. Either way, I was safe inside my locked car. That's when my torch flickered and died. I shook it vigorously, tapped it against my palm, flicked the switch on and off. Nothing. New batteries, gone in an instant. Brilliant, I said aloud, reaching to turn on my car's interior light, and froze. Standing directly in front of my car, illuminated by nothing but the faint glow from my laptop screen, was a figure. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was humanoid, but something about its proportions was wrong. Its arms seemed too long, hanging well past where its knees should be. Its head sat awkwardly on its shoulders, as if it had been placed there rather than grown there. And despite the torrential rain, it appeared to be completely dry. I couldn't make out a face, just a pale oval where features should have been. My heart hammered so violently that I could feel it in my fingertips. I lunged for the key in the ignition, desperate to turn on the headlights, to either see this thing properly or scare it away. The engine sputtered but didn't catch. Again I tried, and again. Nothing. And then, God help me, there was a tap on my driver's side window. I couldn't look. I wouldn't. Instead, I threw myself across to the passenger side, my breath coming in short, painful gasps. Rain hammered on the roof. Thunder rolled across the sky, and the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I dropped it twice before managing to unlock it. The screen's glow was painfully bright in the darkness, but the no service indicator might as well have been a death sentence. Something scraped along the length of my car. Not the innocent brush of branch, but the deliberate drag of something, all the way from the boot to the bonnet. Then back again. I curled into myself, making my body as small as possible against the passenger door, and that's when I heard it, a voice barely audible above the rain. Let me in. The words were perfectly clear, despite the noise of the storm. They sounded normal, human. A man's voice, middle-aged perhaps, with a slight Midwest twang. My car broke down up the road. The voice continued. I'm soaked through. Please. It was so reasonable, so ordinary, that for one mad moment I almost believed it, almost reached for the door handle. Then I remembered what I'd seen in front of my car. That wasn't a stranded motorist. That wasn't even human. I can see you in there, the voice said, a note of petulance creeping in. It's not polite to ignore someone who needs help. I remained frozen, silent, praying that my erratic breathing wasn't as loud as it seemed to my own ears. Something slammed against my window with such force that the entire car rocked. I screamed then, a high, thin sound that didn't seem like it could have come from my own throat. Let me in. The voice was no longer human. It was a guttural snarl, layered with harmonics that no human vocal cords could produce. The car rocked again as something heavy collided with the driver's door. I was certain the windows would shatter, that whatever was out there would be upon me in seconds. I covered my head with my arms, as if that would offer any protection. Another impact, then another. The car swayed like a cradle in a hurricane. And then nothing. The assault stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The only sounds were the rain, my own labored breathing, and the frantic drumming of my pulse in my ears. Seconds stretched into minutes. I didn't move, didn't dare to. Eventually, I mustered the courage to raise my head and peer out of the windows. The darkness was absolute. My laptop had gone into sleep mode, and without its faint glow, I could see nothing at all. I don't know how long I sat there, rigid with terror, every muscle cramped from tension. It felt like hours. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the rain began to ease, not stopping entirely, but lessening from a torrent to a steady shower. Still I didn't move, couldn't move. It wasn't until the first hint of gray dawn began to lighten the sky that I finally uncurled myself in the passenger seat. My whole body ached, and my throat was raw, though I had no memory of screaming beyond that one time. The growing light revealed a forest draped in mist, water dripping from every leaf and branch. My car was undamaged, no dents where the thing had slammed against it, no scratches along the side where it had dragged, whatever it had dragged. Had I imagined it all? A nightmare born of exhaustion and isolation? With trembling hands, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine started immediately, as if there had never been any problem. I was about to put the car in reverse, to get the hell out of there, when something caught my eye. Something pale, lying on the ground just in front of my car. It looked like a piece of clothing, a shirt, perhaps, or a light jacket. Common sense screamed at me to drive away, to never look back, but some perverse curiosity, the same impulse that had driven me into these woods in the first place, made me reach for the door handle. The air outside was frigid and smelled of wet earth and pine. I stepped cautiously from the car, my boots sinking slightly into the sodden ground. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Nothing but the gentle patter of residual raindrops falling from the canopy above. I approached the pale object slowly, ready to bolt back to my car at the first sign of anything. It was indeed a jacket, a rain jacket, the lightweight kind that folds into its own pocket. Pale blue, almost white in the weak morning light, and completely dry, despite lying among a forest that had endured a night-long deluge. I nudged it with my foot, half expected it to move on its own. It didn't. It just lay there, impossibly dry, impossibly clean, against my better judgment. I crouched down and picked it up. It was like any other rain jacket. Synthetic material, zip front, but tucked into the collar. But as I unfolded it, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the breast pocket, in neat embroidery, was a name, my name. And it wasn't just any jacket. It was my jacket, the one I'd left at home because the forecast had promised clear skies. I dropped it as if it had burned me and stumbled back to my car, my heart racing all over again. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it with shaking hands. I put the car in reverse and began to back up, desperate to return to the main road, to civilization, to anywhere but here. As I turned to look out the rear window, guiding my car back along the narrow logging road, I saw it, standing at the edge of the trees, partially obscured by mist and shadow, was a figure from the night before, in the growing daylight. I could see it more clearly, though part of me wishes I couldn't. It was tall, taller than any man I've ever seen, and thin to the point of emaciation. Its skin was the pale gray-white of a fungus that grows in darkness. And its face, God, its face, where features should have been, was instead a smooth blankness, interrupted only by a single vertical slit where a mouth might be. It stood perfectly still, watching me. I know it was watching me, despite having no visible eyes, and it was wearing my jacket. I reversed down that logging road at a speed that threatened to tear the undercarriage out of my car, barely conscious of the branches whipping against the windows or the rocks scraping the chassis. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road, and even then, I drove well above the speed limit until I reached the first town. I didn't stop for fuel, for food, or even to use a toilet. I drove straight home, walked into my house, and locked every door and window. I never returned to Iowa. I sold my camera equipment and found office work, something that keeps me firmly in the city, surrounded by people and concrete and electric light. But sometimes, when it rains heavily at night, I think I hear a tapping at my window, a soft, insistent rhythm that sounds almost like words. Let me in. And I lie awake until dawn, wondering what would have happened if I'd opened that car door. Are you listening to this in the rain? Look outside your window. Is that just water streaming down the glass, or fingers tracing your outline from the other side? Would you know the difference? I wouldn't. Not anymore. Have you ever felt the weight of the earth above you? The absolute darkness that exists only underground, where sunlight has never reached. The kind of darkness so complete that it doesn't matter whether your eyes are open or closed. I have, in the caves of Maquoketa, Iowa, and in that darkness, I discovered something that should have remained buried. I'm a geologist by training, though these days I mostly work as an environmental consultant for construction companies. It's not the most exciting career, but it pays the bills and occasionally allows me to indulge my passion for cave exploration. I've been a recreational spelunker for nearly 15 years, crawling through limestone formations across the Midwest. The Maquoketa Cave State Park is something of a hidden treasure in Iowa. A network of more than a dozen caves ranging from spacious walk-through chambers to narrow crawl spaces that require you to wiggle through on your belly. Most visitors stick to the well-lit, developed caves, the ones with concrete walkways and informational placards, the safe ones. But there are others, less traveled passages, some officially closed to the public due to safety concerns, others simply forgotten or overlooked, their entrances obscured by undergrowth or fallen rock. 3 months ago, I took a week off work to explore the park properly. I'd been there before on day trips, but I wanted time to venture beyond the tourist routes, to find the hidden corners that few people ever see. I booked a campsite for 6 nights and arrived on a Sunday afternoon in late September. The first 3 days were uneventful, pleasant even. I revisited the main attractions, Dance Hall Cave, Hernando's Hideaway, Ice Cave, and began mapping out the less traveled paths for later exploration. The weather was perfect. Crisp autumn days that gave way to cool, clear nights ideal for stargazing. On the 4th day, I woke to a change in the weather. The sky had clouded over during the night, and the air felt heavy with impending rain. The forecast on my phone confirmed it. Thunderstorms likely by late afternoon, continuing through the night. Most people would have rescheduled their explorations. Caves and rain don't mix well. Water levels can rise unpredictably, and some passages that are safe in dry weather become death traps when it storms. But I was running out of time, and there was one particular cave I was keen to investigate, an unnamed formation I'd spotted on an old survey map, but couldn't find referenced in any modern guidebooks. According to my research, its entrance was located on the eastern edge of the park, away from the main trail system. The map showed it as a relatively small cavity, unlikely to contain any significant water channels. I reasoned that even with the rain, it should be safe enough for a quick exploration. I packed light, helmet, headlamp, backup light, first aid kit, water, protein bars, and a small camera. I left a note in my tent detailing where I was going, just in case. Standard safety protocol for solo caving, though I'd never needed to be rescued before. The hike to the approximate location took about 40 minutes. The air was thick and still. Birds unusually quiet, as if they too were waiting for the storm. I checked my GPS against the old map coordinates and began searching the hillside for an opening. It took me nearly an hour to find it. The entrance was smaller than I'd expected, partially concealed by a fallen tree and overgrown with moss and ferns. Had I not been specifically looking for it, I would have walked past without a second glance. I cleared away some of the vegetation and peered inside. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, but appeared to widen after about 6 feet. I could feel a faint current of air emanating from the darkness, suggesting the cave system was larger than the survey had indicated. The first drops of rain began to fall as I switched on my headlamp and prepared to enter. Perfect timing, I thought. I'd be dry underground while the worst of the storm passed over. Slithering through the entrance was awkward but manageable. As predicted, the passage widened after a few feet, allowing me to stand in a small chamber about the size of a modest bedroom. My headlamp illuminated smooth limestone walls, glistening with moisture. No stalactites or stalagmites here. This part of the cave was too young, geologically speaking. A narrow corridor led deeper, sloping gently downward. I followed it, noting how quickly the sound of rain faded behind me. Within minutes, the only sound were my own breathing and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. The passage continued to descend, curving to the right, then sharply to the left. I estimated I'd travel about 100 yards from the entrance and was perhaps 30 feet below the surface when I emerged into a second chamber much larger than the first. My light couldn't reach the far wall or the ceiling, suggesting I was in a significant cavern. The floor was surprisingly level, covered in fine silt that muffled my footsteps. As I advanced, my beam caught glimpses of formations, columns where stalactites and stalagmites had joined, flowstone cascading down walls like frozen waterfalls, delicate soda straws hanging from unseen heights. This was unexpected. The survey map had shown nothing like this. I felt a surge of excitement. Had I discovered an unmapped extension of the cave system? It seemed impossible that something this substantial could have been overlooked. But then, the entrance was well hidden, and perhaps the surveyors simply hadn't pushed far enough inside. I spent about 20 minutes photographing the formations, then continued exploring. The main chamber narrowed again at the far end, splitting into 3 distinct passages. I marked the junction with a small cairn of rocks and chose the middle path, which appeared to be the largest. This new tunnel was different, less natural looking. Somehow, the walls were smoother, the floor more even. It almost resembled a deliberately excavated corridor rather than a natural formation. My geological training suggested water erosion as a cause, but something felt off about it. I'd gone perhaps 50 yards when I began to notice the markings. At first, I thought they were simply mineral stains or natural patterns in the rock. But as I examined them more closely, I realized they were deliberate carvings, crude pictographs etched into the stone walls. They depicted what appeared to be human figures, elongated and stylized, engaged in some sort of ritual or ceremony. In the center of one grouping was a larger figure, distinguished by an elaborate headdress or crown. Surrounding it were smaller figures and postures of supplication. I'm no archaeologist, but I knew enough to recognize that this discovery could be significant. Native American cave art in Iowa isn't unheard of, but it's rare, and these particular images didn't match any style I was familiar with. I carefully photographed each section of markings, making sure my flash illuminated all the details. It was as I was reviewing these images on my camera screen that I first noticed a discrepancy. In one of the photos, there appeared to be an additional figure in the background. A tall, slender silhouette that seemed to be watching the ritual depicted in the carvings. But when I looked back at the actual wall, that figure wasn't there. I assumed it was a trick of light and shadow, or perhaps a flaw in my camera. I took another photo of the same section. This time, the mysterious figure was closer to the center of the ritual gathering. A cold sensation settled in the pit of my stomach. I lowered the camera and stared at the wall directly. Nothing but ancient carvings. I took a third photo. In this one, the figure was no longer part of the carved scene. It was standing just at the edge of the frame, as if it had moved into the periphery of my camera's field of view. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing down the corridor. "Someone else down here?" No response. Of course, I was being ridiculous. Probably just dust on my camera lens, or a peculiarity of how the flash was interacting with the mineral deposits on the walls. I decided I had gone far enough for one day. The storm had likely passed by now, and I wanted to get back to camp before dark. I turned to retrace my steps, and froze. There, on the smooth dirt floor, was a set of footprints. Not mine. These were barefoot impressions, smaller than my boots would make, and they led deeper into the tunnel. I was absolutely certain they hadn't been there when I walked in. My heart began to pound. I swung my light back toward the direction I'd been heading. The tunnel continued into darkness, empty and silent, but the footprints, they couldn't have appeared by themselves. Logic suggested there must be another entrance to this section of cave, and someone else had come in while I was distracted with the carvings. But why would they not respond when I called out? And who would explore a cave system barefoot? I considered my options. The sensible choice was to leave immediately. But curiosity, that fatal flaw of so many horror story protagonists, got the better of me. I had to know where those footprints led, who had made them. I followed them deeper into the tunnel, moving cautiously, calling out periodically. "Hello? Park ranger? Fellow caver?" Only my own voice answered me, bouncing back from unseen walls. The passage began to descend more steeply, and I noticed other changes. The temperature dropped several degrees. The air became noticeably damper, with a faint, unpleasant odor I couldn't quite identify. Something organic, like decaying vegetation, but with an underlying metallic note. After about 5 minutes of careful progress, I emerged into another chamber, smaller than the previous one, but still substantial. Unlike the beautiful formations I'd seen earlier, this room was relatively featureless. Just smooth walls and a flat floor covered in the same fine silt, except for the center of the chamber. There, the floor dipped to form a shallow basin about 15 feet in diameter. In the middle of this depression was a pool of water, perfectly circular, like a mirror laid on the ground. The footprints I'd been following led directly to its edge and stopped. I approached cautiously, playing my light across the pool's surface. The water was absolutely still, showing no ripples despite the occasional drip from the ceiling. And it was black, not the murky brown of most cave pools, but a deep light-absorbing black that seemed to swallow my headlamp's beam rather than reflect it. I knelt at the edge of the pool, careful not to touch the water. Up close, I could see that it wasn't actually black. It was clear, but so deep that my light couldn't penetrate to the bottom. It appeared to be a natural well, or perhaps the top of a flooded vertical shaft. As I leaned forward to get a better look, I saw my reflection for the first time, my face pale in the glow of my headlamp, eyes wide with a combination of wonder and unease. But there was something wrong with my reflection. It seemed delayed, moving a fraction of a second after I did. When I tilted my head, my reflection took just slightly too long to mimic the action. I waved my hand slowly. My reflection waved back, but the timing was off. as if it were deciding whether to copy me, rather than being bound by the laws of physics to do so. A sudden, irrational terror gripped me. I scrambled backwards, away from the pool, breathing hard. This was impossible. Reflections don't work that way. I was tired, or the poor lighting was playing tricks on my perception. The rational explanations calmed me somewhat. I took a deep breath and edged forward again, determined to prove to myself that it had been an illusion. This time, my reflection appeared normal, moving in perfect synchronization with me. I let out a shaky laugh at my own foolishness. Caves could do strange things to your mind if you let them. The darkness, the isolation, the silence. Experienced cavers knew this. I was about to stand up when my reflection smiled. I was not smiling. I recoiled so violently that I lost my balance and fell backwards onto the silted floor. My headlamp slipped, casting its beam across the ceiling rather than the water. I righted it with trembling hands and looked again at the pool. The surface was no longer still. It rippled gently, as if disturbed by something moving beneath it, and my reflection was gone. In its place was something else, a face that resembled mine in its basic structure, but was wrong in 100 subtle ways. The eyes were too large, the mouth too wide. The skin appeared stretched tight over the bones, giving a gaunt, hungry look. As I watched, paralyzed with horror, a hand emerged from the water, a human-looking hand, but with fingers too long and too numerous, joints that bent in impossible directions. It reached toward me, water streaming from its pale flesh. I scrambled to my feet and ran, back up the tunnel, heart pounding so hard I could feel in my throat. I didn't look back, didn't stop to collect the small cairn of rocks I'd left at the junction. I just ran, fueled by blind panic, taking the turns that seemed to lead upward. It was only when I was gasping for breath, legs burning with exertion, that I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. This wasn't the passage I'd come in through. The floor was sloping downward again, not up toward the surface, and the smooth, almost artificial quality of the walls had given way to rough, natural stone. I stopped, trying to get my bearings. My headlamp flickered, a brief dimming that sent a spike of fresh terror through me. The batteries were running low. I should have changed them before entering the cave, but I'd assumed this would be a short exploration. I needed to calm down, to think rationally. Getting lost in the panic was the worst thing I could do. I took several deep breaths and tried to visualize the path I'd taken. I must have missed the main junction somehow. If I backtracked carefully, I could find it again. I turned around and saw it. Standing in the center of the tunnel, about 20 feet away, was a figure, human in shape, but wrong in proportion. Too tall, too thin, its arms hanging nearly to the ground. In the dim light of my failing headlamp, I couldn't make out its features clearly, but I could see that its skin glistened wetly, as if it had recently emerged from water. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I could feel its gaze like a physical weight, despite not being able to see its eyes. "Who are you?" My voice emerged as a croak. "What do you want?" No response, just that patient, terrible stillness. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. When I put about 50 feet between us, I turned and began to walk rapidly away, fighting the urge to run blindly. I needed to conserve my energy, to think clearly. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing until I had to turn sideways to squeeze through, sometimes opening into small chambers with multiple exits. I chose paths that seemed to lead upward, hoping to find my way back to the surface. My headlamp continued to dim. Soon it was casting little more than a feeble glow. barely enough to see a few feet ahead. I switched to my backup light, a small but powerful LED torch that should have provided ample illumination. It worked for perhaps 2 minutes before flickering and dying completely. I was now in absolute darkness. The kind of darkness that exists nowhere on the Earth's surface, not even on a moonless night in the most remote wilderness. A darkness so complete that it feels like a physical presence pressing against your eyes. I stopped moving, knowing that to continue blindly would be suicide in a cave environment. I fumbled for my phone, thinking to use its flashlight function, but when I tried to turn it on, nothing happened. The battery, which had been at 80% when I entered the cave, was completely drained. That was when I heard it. The soft, wet sound of footsteps approaching from behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, accompanied by a dragging noise, as if something heavy was being pulled along the ground. I pressed myself against the wall, hoping irrationally that the darkness would hide me. The footsteps came closer, stopped, a sound of breathing, ragged bubbling, like someone who had fluid in their lungs. "I know you're there," said a voice. It was disconcertingly normal, a man's voice, middle-aged, with a slight Iowa accent, the kind of voice you might hear at a local hardware store or diner. "I can help you find your way out." Every instinct screamed at me not to respond, not to reveal my position, but the darkness and my fear had disoriented me completely. I had no idea which direction would lead to the surface. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice barely above a whisper. "A fellow explorer," the voice replied. It seemed to come from much closer now, though I hadn't heard it move. "I know these caves well, very well indeed. Are you with the Park Service?" A low chuckle, like water flowing over stones. "No, I've been here much longer than the park. Before there were parks. Before there were people to make parks." I felt movement in the air near my face, as if something had reached out to touch me, but stopped just short of contact. "You saw the old drawings." The voice continued conversationally. "Did you understand what they depicted? The ceremony? The offering?" I shook my head, then realized the gesture was meaningless in the absolute darkness. "No," I said, "I didn't. The First Peoples knew about us." The voice said, "They knew what lived beneath the surface, what slumbered in the water. They brought gifts to keep us content." Another movement in the air, this time definitely a touch, cold, damp fingers brushing against my cheek. I flinched away, pressing harder against the wall. "Don't be afraid," the voice soothed. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to show you something. Something wonderful. Down below, where the water meets the deep earth." I need to get back," I stammered. "People are expecting me. They'll come looking if I don't return." "Of course they will," the voice agreed. "Later, much later, when the rain stops. But it's raining quite hard now, you know. The entrance you use, it's underwater already. Flash flood, very dangerous. You're lucky I found you." My blood ran cold. Could it be true? The entrance was narrow, at the bottom of a slope. If there was significant rainfall, it could indeed flood. But this thing, whatever it was, couldn't be trusted. Yet I was lost in complete darkness. My lights failed, my phone dead. Without help, my chances of finding my way out were virtually non-existent. As if reading my thoughts, the voice spoke again. "You have two choices. Stay here, alone in the dark, until your air runs out. Or come with me to where there's light of a kind. Not your sun, but light nonetheless. And if I go with you, what happens then?" A pause. "Then you'll see what few humans ever have. The true world beneath this shallow shell you live upon. The water's kingdom. With a suddenness that made me gasp, my backup light flickered back to life. The beam was weak, but sufficient to illuminate the speaker. It had a man's face, or something close to it. Handsome in a gaunt, aristocratic way, with high cheekbones and deep-set eyes. But the skin was the bloodless white of a cave fish, and those eyes, they were huge, lidless, and entirely black, like pools of the same light-swallowing water I'd seen earlier. It smiled, revealing teeth that were too numerous and too sharp for a human mouth. "Ah," it said, "there you are." I ran, blindly, desperately, with no thought but escape. My light bounced wildly, casting monstrous shadows that seemed to reach for me from every direction. Behind me, I heard not pursuit but laughter, a sound like water rushing down a drain. By some miracle, or perhaps it let me go, I found myself in familiar territory. The tunnel with the pictographs, then the large chamber with the beautiful formations. I was so focused on escape that I nearly missed the small cairn of rocks I'd left at the junction. I took the correct passage this time, stumbling in my haste but never stopping. When I finally emerged in the cave entrance, it was into a world transformed by water. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the forest floor into a network of muddy streams. Night had fallen while I was underground, and the darkness above was nearly as complete as that below, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning. I didn't stop until I reached my campsite, where I found my tent partially collapsed under the weight of the rain. I grabbed what essentials I could, abandoned the rest, and drove through the storm to the nearest motel. It wasn't until the next morning, as I was checking out the mud-caked clothes I'd worn in the cave, that I found it, a small, smooth stone in my pocket that I knew I hadn't collected. It was black as night, perfectly round and cool to the touch despite being in my warm pocket all night. When I held it up to the light, I could see something inside it. A tiny scene captured like an insect in amber, a group of stylized human figures, identical to those in the cave drawings, gathered around a circular pool, and rising from the water, a tall, thin figure with too many fingers and eyes like bottomless wells. I threw it away, checked out of the motel, drove home, without stopping except for fuel. But sometimes, on rainy nights like tonight, I think I can hear that voice again, reasonable, conversational, with its slight Iowa accent. I just want to show you something wonderful. And I find myself drawn to water, to lakes and rivers, to swimming pools, and even bathtubs. I find myself staring at my reflection, waiting for it to move independently, to smile when I am not smiling. Because here's the thing about caves, about dark places deep beneath the earth. You can leave them, can walk out into the sunlight and tell yourself you're safe. But sometimes you bring something back with you, something that waits, patient as stone, for the right moment to emerge. Are you listening to this in the rain? Is there a body of water near you? A lake, a pool, even a bathtub filled for an evening soak? Look at your reflection. Look carefully. Is it truly yours? Does it move exactly when you move? Or is there the slightest delay, the faintest suggestion that what looks back at you is not bound by the same laws that bind you? I wouldn't know the difference anymore. Would you? Have you ever driven through the farmlands of Iowa at night? Not the highways with their streaming headlights and reassuring gas stations, but the narrow county roads that cut through endless fields of corn and soybeans, roads where the darkness is absolute save for your headlights, where the tallest things for miles are solitary farmhouses and silent grain silos that loom like sentinels against the star-filled sky. I have, and I've learned that sometimes those roads lead to places that aren't marked on any map. places that perhaps shouldn't be found at all. It was late September. Just over a year ago, I was driving back to Des Moines after visiting my sister in Omaha. It should have been a straightforward journey, just under 2 hours on Interstate 80. But there was construction that night, long queues of traffic crawling past crews working under harsh floodlights. After 30 minutes of barely moving, I made the fateful decision to take an alternate route. I exited the highway at the next opportunity and consulted my GPS for a detour. It suggested a series of county roads that would eventually reconnect with the interstate beyond the construction. The route would add about 40 minutes to my journey, but it seemed preferable to sitting in gridlock. At first, it was pleasant enough. The roads were empty, the night was clear, and there was something peaceful about driving past the darkened farms and fields, knowing that all around me, people were settling in for the night in cozy farmhouses while I had the road to myself. The problems began about an hour into the detour. My GPS signal became erratic, the friendly blue line on the screen freezing, then jumping, then disappearing altogether. I wasn't particularly concerned. I had a general sense of which direction I needed to go, and I figured I'd eventually hit a main road with signs pointing toward Des Moines. I continued straight at the next intersection, reasonably confident I was still on the right track. The road narrowed, the asphalt giving way to gravel that crunched beneath my tires. Still, it seemed to be heading in the correct direction, so I pressed on. The cornfields on either side seemed to grow taller, closer to the road. In my headlights, the stalks looked brittle and pale, ready for harvest. It was odd that they hadn't been cut yet. Most farmers would have brought in their corn by late September. I drove for another 20 minutes without seeing a single house, barn, or cross street. Just endless fields of corn under a sky that had begun to cloud over, obscuring the stars that had previously provided at least some illumination beyond my headlights. I was considering turning back when my headlights swept across a small wooden sign at a fork in the road. The left fork continued as gravel, but the right fork returned to blessed asphalt. The sign was weather-beaten and faded, but I could just make out an arrow pointing right, and the words, Heber's Mill, 5 miles. I didn't know Heber's Mill, but any town meant the possibility of clearer directions and perhaps a main road that would lead back to highway. I took the right fork, relieved to feel smooth pavement under my tires again. The road curved gently through the cornfields, which now pressed right up to the edge of the asphalt, their dry leaves brushing against my car as I passed. There were no reflective markers on the road, no white or yellow lines, just black pavement barely visible beyond the reach of my headlights. It was as I rounded a particularly sharp bend that I saw the first sign of human habitation in what felt like hours. A single light in the distance, a warm yellow glow that stood out against the encompassing darkness. As I drew closer, I could make out a small building set back from the road. Not a house, but a kind of roadside stand or small shop. A hand-painted sign hung above the door. Hills Produce and Sundries, EST 1923. Below this, a smaller sign declared open in faded red letters. An open shop this late, on such a remote road? It seemed unlikely, but the lights were definitely on, and I could see movement inside. Perhaps it was my chance to ask for directions. I pulled over, the gravel shoulder crunching under my tires. The air when I stepped out of the car was unexpectedly cold, carrying the earthy scent of corn and something else, a sweetish, almost cloying smell I couldn't quite identify. I approached the shop, noting the ancient petrol pump standing sentinel by the door, its gauge frozen at a price per gallon that hadn't been current in decades. A bell jangled as I pushed open the door. The interior was cluttered but clean, shelves stocked with goods, homemade preserves in mason jars, and various household items. A glass-fronted cooler hung in the corner, containing soft drinks and what looked like wrapped meat packages. Behind the counter stood an elderly man, tall and rail-thin, with a face so lined and weathered it resembled the bark of an ancient oak. He wore denim overalls over a flannel shirt, and a John Deere cap sat atop his sparse white hair. "Evening," he said, his voice like dry leaves rustling. "Bit late to be out on these roads." "I'm afraid I'm a bit lost," I admitted. "I was trying to get back to Des Moines, but my GPS gave out, and I've been driving through cornfields for the past hour." He nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Des Moines, is it? You're a fair piece off course, then. Where'd you come from to get so turned around?" I explained about the construction on I-80 and my ill-fated detour. As I spoke, I noticed something odd about the shop. Despite the EST 1923 claim on the sign, many of the products look remarkably contemporary, current soft drink brands, candy bars with modern packaging. Yet other items seem genuinely antique, with labels and designs I remember from my childhood or had seen only in vintage advertisements. Harvest season's a bad time to be lost on these roads, the old man said when I finished my explanation, especially after dark. There was something in his tone that made me uneasy, a warning that went beyond the obvious concern for a traveler on unfamiliar rural roads at night. "Why is that?" I asked, his eyes, pale blue and surprisingly sharp, fixed on mine. "Some harvests ain't just for corn," he said cryptically. Then, perhaps sensing my confusion, he added more practically, "You'll want to take Reaper's Road to Highway 6. That'll get you back toward Des Moines." Reaper's Road? The name didn't exactly inspire confidence. "Just an old local name," he said with a thin smile, "on account of the big combine harvester accident back in '56. Proper name's County Road 27. Straight on through Heber's Mill, then right at the old grain silo. Can't miss it." I thanked him and turned to leave, but his voice stopped me at the door. "One piece of advice, stranger, don't stop for nobody between here and Highway 6. No matter what you see or hear, some folks around here get peculiar notions during harvest time." The bell jangled again as I stepped back into the night, a sudden gust of wind sending dry leaves skittering across the gravel. I hurried back to my car, the old man's warning echoing in my mind. As I pulled back onto the road, fat droplets of rain began to spatter against my windscreen. Within minutes, it had developed into a proper downpour, sheets of water reducing visibility to just a few yards ahead. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the rain, grateful for the yellow line that had mysteriously appeared in the middle of the road after the shop, giving me at least some guidance. The rain hammered on the roof, a constant drumming punctuated by the rhythmic sweep of my wipers. I was so focused on the road immediately ahead that I almost missed the sign announcing I was entering Heber's Mill, population 153. The town, when it appeared out of the darkness, was little more than a collection of buildings clustered around a crossroads. Most were dark, but a few windows glowed yellow against the night. In the center stood what I presumed was the eponymous mill, a tall, weathered structure with a water wheel visible on one side, incongruously alongside a modern-looking petrol station. I drove slowly through deserted Main Street, the rain creating halos around a few streetlights. No pedestrians braved the downpour. No other cars moved on the roads. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something. At the far end of the town, just as the old man had said, stood a massive grain silo, its metal sides gleaming dully in my headlights. I turned right, onto what I hoped was County Road 27, Reaper's Road. This new road was narrower than the one that had led me to Heber's Mill, with fields of corn pressing close on both sides. But the pavement was good, and the yellow line continued down the center, a reassuring guide through the stormy night. I'd been driving for perhaps 10 minutes when I saw the figure. It was standing at the side of the road, partially illuminated by my headlights, a solitary person in the pouring rain, arm outstretched in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. I instinctively began to slow down. It seemed cruel to leave someone out in such weather, in such an isolated spot. But then the old shopkeeper's warning echoed in my mind. Don't stop for nobody between here and Highway 6, no matter what you see or hear. I hesitated, foot hovering between accelerator and brake. As my car drew nearer, I could make out more details of the figure. A man, I thought, wearing what appeared to be overalls similar to those a shopkeeper had worn. His face was hidden by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Something about his stillness, the way he didn't move even as my headlights fully illuminated him, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the car's air conditioning. I made my decision and pressed the accelerator, intending to drive past without stopping. As I drew level with the figure, lightning flashed, briefly transforming the night into harsh, white daylight. In that split second of illumination, I saw the hitchhiker clearly for the first time. It wasn't a man at all. Where a face should have been beneath the hat brim was nothing but a tangle of corn husks and twisted straw, formed into a crude approximation of human features. The outstretched hand was not flesh, but corn stalks, bound together and ending in sharpened points rather than fingers. I gasped, instinctively jerking the steering wheel away from the horrifying scarecrow-like entity. My car swerved, tires momentarily losing traction on the rain-slicked road before I regained control. In my rear-view mirror, I could see the figure still standing motionless by the roadside, arm outstretched. It hadn't moved, hadn't turned to watch me pass. It simply waited, as if certain another traveler would come along. My heart pounding, I focused on the road ahead, try to convince myself that I'd simply seen an actual scarecrow, placed bizarrely close to the road by some farmer with an odd sense of humor. The lightning and rain had played tricks with my perception. That's all. I had almost succeeded in rationalizing the experience when I saw another figure ahead, standing in the middle of the road this time rather than at the side. I slowed, not wanting to hit someone, but deeply uneasy after what I'd just seen. As I drew closer, my headlights revealed another straw figure, this one more elaborate than the first. It wore what appeared to be actual clothing, a floral dress, soaked through with rain, but the limbs protruding from the garment were clearly fashioned from bundled corn stalks. The head was a burlap sack stuffed with straw, with holes cut for eyes and a stitched line for a mouth. I stopped about 20 feet away, engine idling. This thing was blocking the road completely. I couldn't drive around it without risking going into the ditch. I honked my horn, hoping the noise would cause whatever sick prankster who had placed this effigy to reveal themselves, or at least to move their creation out of my path. The sound echoed across the fields, but nothing changed. The rain continued to pour, and the straw figure remained immobile in my headlights. I was considering backing up and trying to find another route when the figure's head slowly pivoted toward me, not the whole body turning, just a burlap head rotating on the straw neck, the crude eye holes fixing on my car. Then, with movements that were both jerky and horribly fluid, it began to walk toward me. Each step was accompanied by a dry, rustling sound just audible over the rain, the sound of corn stalks rubbing against each other. I threw the car into reverse, but before I could accelerate, something thudded against the boot. I looked in the rear-view mirror to see the first figure I'd passed now, directly behind my car, its straw hand pressed against the rear window. I was trapped between them. Panic surged through me. I slammed the car into drive and floored the accelerator, aiming directly at the figure in the floral dress. There was no solid body to hit. I told myself it was just straw and fabric. It would fall apart under my bumper. The car shot forward, engine roaring. But just before impact, the straw woman stepped smoothly aside with an almost balletic grace that was obscene in such a construct. As I hurtled past, I felt something scrape along the passenger side of my car, straw fingers dragging across the metal. I didn't slow down. I kept the accelerator pressing floor, taking curves too fast, tires struggling for purchase on the wet asphalt. In my mirrors, I could see no sign of pursuit, but the image of those straw figures was burned into my mind, along with the certainty that there would be more ahead. The rain intensified, becoming a solid wall of water that my wipers could barely clear. I should have slowed down. Driving so fast in such conditions was asking for an accident. But fear kept my foot heavy on the accelerator. It was that same fear that nearly killed me when I came around a bend to find a road ahead completely blocked by a wall of straw figures. Dozens of them standing shoulder to shoulder across the asphalt. Some wore clothing. Others were simply bundles of corn stalks roughly shaped into human form. But all had those same terrible burlap faces with their cutout eyes. I slammed on the brakes, the car hydroplaning, before coming to a stop just feet from the straw wall. For a moment, nothing moved. The figures stood silent in the rain, watching me with their empty burlap eyes, waiting. Then, as one, they began to shuffle forward. Pure instinct took over. I wrenched the steering wheel to the left and accelerated directly into the cornfield beside the road. Stalks snapped against my windscreen and scraped along the sides of my car as I plowed through. My only thought to put distance between myself and those shuffling straw horrors. Driving through a mature cornfield is almost impossible in normal circumstances. The stalks are surprisingly sturdy, the ground uneven and often muddy. In a torrential downpour at night, it was madness, but madness driven by terror has its own momentum. I don't know how far I drove through that field. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The car lurched and bumped over unseen obstacles, corn stalks whipping against the windows in a constant, maddening barrage. The engine protested, threatening to stall with each new challenge to its power. When I finally broke through to open ground, it was so sudden that I nearly lost control. One moment I was fighting to the cornfield. The next, I was bouncing across what appeared to be a recently harvested field. Nothing but stubble beneath my tires. I slowed, trying to orient myself. Through the curtain of rain, I could make out a structure ahead. Large, rectangular, with a peaked roof. A barn, perhaps, where I might take shelter and wait for daylight. As I drew closer, I realized it wasn't a barn but a large metal shed or warehouse of some kind. There were no windows, just a pair of tall sliding doors, one of which stood partially open. A pale light spilled out from this opening, cutting a swath through the darkness. I stopped a short distance away, uncertain. The old shopkeeper's warning still echoed in my mind. Yet I was lost, my car possibly damaged from cross-countryscape, and the rain showed no signs of abating. I needed help, or at least shelter. I made my decision and drove slowly toward the building. Stopping just outside the pool of light, I would approach cautiously, assess the situation, and retreat to my car at the first sign of anything amiss. The rain seemed to lessen as I stepped out, reduced to a gentle patter rather than the driving downpour moments before. The air smelled of wet earth and something else, that same sweet, cloying scent I'd noticed outside the roadside shop. Stronger now. I approached the partially open door, hearing machinery running inside, the steady, rhythmic thudding punctuated by occasional metallic screeches. Some kind of processing plant, perhaps? But what would be operating in the middle of the night, in such an isolated location? I peered through the gap, and what I saw inside froze the blood in my veins. It was indeed a processing plant of sorts, but not for any crop I recognized. The large open space was filled with conveyor belts and strange mechanical apparatus, all in motion. Workers in overalls and heavy gloves moved among the machinery, their faces hidden behind burlap masks identical to those worn by the straw figures on the road. And on those conveyor belts, God help me, they were processing people, not living people. At least, I pray they weren't alive. They lay still on the belts, being moved through various stations where the masked workers methodically disassembled them. At one station, limbs were removed and fed into a large grinder. At another, torsos were split open, their contents harvested and placed in large metal containers. At a third, emptied chest cavities were stuffed with straw and corn husks. I stumbled back from the door, bile rising in my throat. This couldn't be real. It was a nightmare, a hallucination, anything but reality. A hand fell on my shoulder. I whirled around to find myself facing one of the workers. His features hidden behind that terrible burlap mask with its crude eye holes. He wore overalls darkened with stains I didn't want to identify, and his gloved hands were similarly marked. "You took a wrong turn," he said, his voice surprisingly normal, with a flat accent of rural Iowa. "Folks ain't supposed to find this place." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. Terror had paralyzed me completely. "But since you're here," he continued, reaching up to remove his mask, "you might as well see what's behind the curtain." The face revealed was entirely human. A middle-aged man with ruddy cheeks and gray-flecked stubble. He could have been any farmer or factory worker in the Midwest, except for his eyes. They were empty, not in the poetic sense of being devoid of emotion, but literally empty. Black holes in his face, with small stalks of corn visible in their depths. He smiled, revealing teeth that weren't teeth at all, but kernels of corn arranged in a grotesque parody of a human mouth. "We all got to serve the harvest," he said, reaching for me. "One way or another." I ran back to my car, fumbling with the keys, dropping them in a puddle before finally managing to unlock the door and throw myself inside. The engine started on the first try, a small mercy in a night bereft of them. As I reversed, wheels spinning in the mud, I saw more figures emerging from the building. Some wore the burlap masks. Others displayed their terrible corn-filled faces openly. All moved with that same jerky yet fluid motion I'd seen in the straw woman on the road. I spun the car around and accelerated across the stubble field. No destination in mind except away. In my mirrors, I could see the figures growing smaller, making no attempt to pursue. They simply stood in the rain, watching me flee. I drove blindly through fields and down dirt tracks, eventually finding a paved road that led to another, and finally to blessed Highway 6. Its familiar sign, the most welcome sight I'd ever beheld. I didn't stop driving until I reached Des Moines, pulling into a brightly lit petrol station just as the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky. My car was a mess, mud-splattered, dented, with corn leaves and stalks still wedged in the grill and wheel wells. As I was cleaning the worst of it, I noticed something protruding from beneath my windscreen wiper, a small burlap pouch, secured with twine. Heart pounding, I carefully untied it and looked inside. Corn kernels, dozens of them, pale yellow and perfectly ordinary, except for one at the very bottom of the pouch. It was larger than the others, with an odd texture that wasn't quite vegetable matter. When I picked it up, I realized with horror what it was: a human tooth, partially transformed, becoming something that was neither dentine nor corn, but some hideous hybrid of the two. I dropped it as it burned and fled to the safety of the petrol station shop, where I spent an hour drinking coffee under the fluorescent lights, waiting for the world to make sense again. I've told myself many times since that night that what I experienced was some kind of hallucination. Exhaustion combined with the stress of being lost, perhaps, or even something I ate or drank affecting my perception. The processing plant must have been an ordinary agricultural facility. The workers, normal people whose appearances were distorted by my frightened mind. But I've never driven through rural Iowa again, especially not during harvest season. And sometimes when I open a can of corn for dinner, I find myself examining each kernel carefully before I can bring myself to eat. Are you listening to this in the rain? Can you hear the corn growing outside your window, reaching skyward? preparing for its own peculiar harvest? And when you next drive those long, dark roads between fields that stretch to the horizon, will you stop if you see a figure by the roadside, arm outstretched? I wouldn't. Not in Iowa. Not during harvest time. Not ever again. Have you ever found yourself on the banks of the Mississippi River late at night, when fog hangs low over the water and the distant lights of riverside towns seem more like mirages in reality? There's something about great rivers after dark, a timelessness, a sense that the boundary between this world and whatever lies beyond has grown thin. I've always felt it, even as a child, but it wasn't until last November that I discovered just how permeable that boundary could be. I'm a photographer specializing in Americana, small towns, forgotten places, the back roads and byways of country that's rapidly homogenizing. I was in eastern Iowa completing a project on river communities. Those towns that grew up alongside the Mississippi in the days when the Great River was America's most important highway. My trip had been productive but exhausting. 2 weeks of driving from town to town, capturing dawn light on weathered buildings, dusk settling over water, and particular melancholy of Midwestern towns in late autumn. I was on my final night, staying at a small bed and breakfast in a town called Millport, a once thriving river port that now survived primarily on tourism and nostalgia. The elderly couple who ran the B&B had been particularly helpful, suggesting locations I might photograph and sharing stories about the river's history. It was a husband, Harold, who mentioned the old ferry. "If you're looking for something with real character," he said over breakfast, "you might want to check out Blackwood's Crossing, about 15 miles south of here. There used to be a ferry there back before they built the bridge." "Is the ferry still running?" I asked, intrigued. Harold and his wife exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. "No," he said after a pause. "Not officially, anyway. But the old dock is still there, and the ferry house makes for atmospheric photos, especially with this weather rolling in." He wasn't wrong about the weather. The forecast predicted rain by evening, with fog developing overnight. Not ideal for driving, but perfect for the moody, atmospheric shots I specialized in. I spent the day photographing Millport, capturing its faded storefronts, the small marina with its mixture of fishing boats and pleasure craft, and the massive grain elevator that dominated the skyline. By late afternoon, I'd shot most of what interested me, and my thoughts turned to Harold's suggestion. Blackwood's Crossing wasn't on my map, but Harold had drawn me rough directions on a napkin. "Just follow River Road south," he'd said. "You'll see a weathered sign on the right. Can't miss it." The rain began as I was loading my equipment into the car, a gentle drizzle that promised to intensify. I debated postponing the trip to the old ferry crossing, but this was my last night in Iowa. Tomorrow I'd be heading back to Chicago, then on to my next assignment. It was now or never. River Road was exactly as you might imagine, a narrow, winding route that followed the Mississippi's contours, sometimes running right alongside the water, other times climbing to offer spectacular views from bluffs. In better weather, I would have stopped repeatedly to take photos, but as dusk approached and the rain intensified, I focused on finding Blackwood's Crossing before darkness fell completely. Harold was right about the sign, whether to the point of illegibility, but still standing. I nearly missed a turn despite his assurance. It was little more than a gap in trees with a rutted dirt road leading down toward the river. I hesitated, eyeing my sedan dubiously. The road didn't look suitable for anything less robust than a four-wheel drive, especially in the rain. But I could see the river below and what appeared to be structures, presumably the ferry dock and house Harold had mentioned. The desire for one more good shot outweighed my caution. I turned onto the dirt road, driving slowly, wincing at every scrape of undercarriage against uneven ground. The trees closed in on both sides, creating a tunnel that wound downward toward the water. When I emerged from the trees, I found myself in a small clearing that ended at a wooden dock extending into the river. Beside it stood a building that must have been the ferry house. A sturdy structure of weathered timber with a metal roof patched in multiple places. It looked long abandoned, its windows dark, the paint peeled away by decades of river weather. Beyond the dock, the Mississippi stretched wide and gray in the fading light, the Illinois shore barely visible through the rain and gathering mist. It was a desolate scene, but exactly the kind of forgotten, atmospheric place I'd built my reputation capturing. I parked as close to the ferry house as I could, grabbed my camera bag and raincoat, and stepped out into the steadily increasing downpour. The air smelled of wet earth and river, that distinctive muddy, organic scent that all great waterways seem to share. I worked quickly, wanting to catch the last of the light. I photographed the ferry house from several angles, then the dock with its missing planks and listing pilings. I was setting up a shot of the river itself when I noticed something odd. At the end of the dock, partially obscured by rain and growing darkness, was what appeared to be a small boat. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I was certain of it. Yet there it was, a low, dark shape bobbing gently against the pilings. Curious, I walked out onto the dock, testing each plank before putting my full weight on it. The wood was slick with rain, and many boards shifted ominously underfoot, but it held. As I drew closer, I realized it wasn't a boat at all, at least not in the conventional sense. It was a flat-bottomed ferry barge, much smaller than I would have expected, perhaps 20 feet long and 12 wide. There was no pilot house, just a railing around the perimeter and what looked like a manual winch system at one end, presumably one's connected to a cable that stretched across the river. It looked ancient, the metal parts rusted, the wooden deck gray with age. Yet somehow it floated steadily, riding low in the water as if weighed down. I raised my camera to capture this unexpected find, but as I did, I noticed movement on the barge. A figure stood at the far end, so still I had mistaken it for a post or equipment of some kind. I lowered my camera. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding thin against the patter of rain on wood and water. The figure didn't respond or move. It remained unnaturally still, a silhouette that seemed slightly too tall, slightly too thin to be a normal person. I was about to retreat when it spoke. Passage. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It carried clearly despite the rain, as if it didn't have to travel through air at all, but instead manifested directly in my ears. "I'm sorry," I replied, taking an involuntary step backward. "Do you seek passage?" The figure asked again, with the same unnerving vocal quality. I should have left then. Everything about the situation felt wrong. The sudden appearance of the ferry, this strange figure with its androgynous voice, the growing darkness and isolation. But curiosity has always been my downfall. "Are you the ferry operator?" I asked. A sound that might have been laughter came from the figure, though it held no mirth. "I am the ferryman," it said, "and you have come at the crossing hour." The rain suddenly intensified, becoming a solid curtain that obscured everything beyond the dock. The temperature seemed to drop precipitously, my breath fogging in the chill air. "I'm just here to take photographs," I said, having to raise my voice above the downpour. I didn't know the ferry was still operating. "It operates when needed," the figure replied, "when someone seeks to cross." "Cross to Illinois, you mean?" I gestured vaguely toward the far shore, invisible now through the rain. Another of those mirthless laughs. Some call it that. Every instinct was now screaming at me to leave, but a peculiar lethargy had settled over me. My limbs felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish. It was as if the rain wasn't just falling on me, but through me, weighing me down, rooting me to the spot. "I don't need to cross," I managed to say. "I'm just passing through." Everyone crosses. Eventually, the figure said, some sooner than others. It moved then, taking a single step forward, and I caught my first clear glimpse of the ferryman. It wore what appeared to be a long, dark coat that hung to its ankles, the material neither quite fabric nor quite liquid, seeming to absorb the light around it. Its face was hidden within a deep hood, but I had the distinct impression that if I could see into that darkness, I would find something other than a human countenance. The fee is the same for all, it continued, extending a hand from within the sleeve of its coat. The hand was pale and gaunt, with fingers too long and too jointed to be natural. One token of your choosing. I don't have any tokens, I said, my voice barely a whisper now. Everyone carries something of value, the ferryman replied. A memory, a regret, a secret. I take any of these as payment. As it spoke, I became aware of other movements on the ferry barge, shapes stirring in the darkness, figures rising from the deck where no figures had been before. They were indistinct, more suggestion than substance, human shape but lacking definition, like people viewed through frosted glass. Who are they? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Passengers, the ferryman said simply, as you will be. One of the shapes moved to the edge of the barge, closest to the dock where I stood. As it drew nearer, it became more distinct. A woman in clothing that might have been fashionable in the 1940s, her edges blurring and reforming as if she couldn't quite maintain her solidity. Don't, she said, her voice echoing as if from a great distance. Don't give him anything. Don't get on. The ferryman made a sharp gesture, and the woman's form dispersed like smoke in a strong wind, only to reform moments later back among the other shadows. The choice is always yours, the ferryman said, its tone unchanged. But the crossing must be made eventually. Why not now, when the night is dark and the rain falls heavy? It's a good night for crossing. I took another step back, my heel connecting with the edge of a loose plank. It shifted beneath me, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I would fall backward into the river. I managed to right myself, but the near miss broke whatever spell had been holding me in place. No, I said, with more conviction than I felt. I'm not crossing tonight. The ferryman remained still for a long moment, its hand still extended. Then, slowly, it withdrew the hand back into its sleeve. Another time, then, it said, and I could have sworn there was disappointment in that unervingly neutral voice. But remember, photographer forgotten places, you have been to the crossing. Part of you remains here, waiting, and when you return, as all who have seen the ferry must, I will be waiting also. The rain intensified again, becoming a solid wall of water that obscured everything beyond arm's length. I turned and hurried back along the dock, no longer careful about testing planks before stepping on them, driven by a primal need to be away from that place. I reached my car, fumbled with the keys, and practically threw myself inside. The engine started on the first try, and I reversed up the muddy track, not stopping until I reached the paved road. Only then did I look back. Through the rain-streaked rear window, I could see the ferry dock. It was empty. No barge, no ferryman, no ghostly passengers. Just a dilapidated wooden structure extending into the dark river. I drove back to Millport in a daze, the windscreen wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. At the B&B, I must have looked as shaken as I felt, because Harold immediately offered me a generous measure of whiskey, which I accepted gratefully. "Did you find Blackwood's Crossing?" he asked, studying me with concern. I nodded, taking a large swallow of the burning liquid. "The ferry was there," I said, watching his reaction carefully. A shadow crossed his face. "Ah," he said softly, "it was that kind of night, was it?" "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question. Harold sighed, looking suddenly much older. "It's a local thing. Not something we discuss with outsiders, generally. But yes, there are stories about the old ferry, about what appears there on certain nights. It offered me passage, I said, my voice trembling slightly despite the warmth of the whiskey. The ferryman, it wanted payment. Harold nodded gravely. And you declined, obviously, since you're here. What would have happened if I hadn't? If I'd given it what it wanted and boarded the ferry? He looked at me for a long moment, then glanced toward the window where rain lashed against the glass. No one knows for certain, he said finally, because those who accept the ferryman's offer don't come back to tell the tale. I stayed up late that night, unable to sleep despite my exhaustion. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, questioning whether it had actually happened or if I'd somehow hallucinated the entire thing. Perhaps I'd been working too hard, or the dim light, and rain had played tricks on my perception. But when I reviewed the photos on my camera, the final image made my blood run cold. It showed the dock extending into the misty river, and at the end, caught in the moment before I'd noticed it, was a ferry barge. The image was blurry from the rain, but clear enough to show the dark figure standing at the far end, its face a void within the hood of its coat. And surrounding it, visible in my photograph though they had been only half seen by my naked eye, were dozens of figures, men, women, children, their forms transparent but unmistakable, their faces turned toward the camera with expressions of mingled hope and despair. I left Millport the next morning, declining Harold's offer to show me some more conventional local attractions. I drove straight back to Chicago without stopping, the memory of the ferryman's words echoing in my mind. Part of you remains here waiting. In the months since, I've researched Blackwood's crossing extensively. The actual ferry service closed in 1938, when a bridge was built 10 miles downstream. The last official ferryman was a man named Elias Blackwood, who reportedly refused to cease operations even after the ferry was officially decommissioned. According to local newspaper archives, Blackwood continued to operate the ferry illegally for several months, primarily at night. Then, during a November storm much like the one I had experienced, he and the ferry disappeared. The barge was found downriver 2 days later, empty and partially submerged. Blackwood's body was never recovered. But the strangest detail, the one that keeps me awake on rainy nights, was discovered in a small item from the local paper dated a week after Blackwood's disappearance. A young couple reported taking the ferry across the river late one night, saying they'd been charged an unusual fee. The man had been asked to surrender the memory of his first love, while the woman had given up the name she'd chosen for her daughter she would now never have. They described the ferryman as unusually tall and thin, his face hidden in the shadow of a hood. The newspaper dismissed it as a prank or confusion. After all, the ferry was gone, Blackwood missing. There could have been no crossing. Yet I know better. And on nights when rain falls heavy and fog rises from the water, I feel a pull, an urge to return to that weathered dock and see if the ferry awaits. I've resisted so far, but I understand now what the ferryman meant. Part of me was left at that crossing, and it calls to the rest of me to make it whole again. Are you listening to this in the rain? Can you hear water lapping against wood? The creak of an old ferry barge rising and falling with the current? If you find yourself near a river after dark and see a dock stretching into mist, ask yourself, what memory, what regret, what secret would you surrender for passage? What lies across that dark water that calls to you so insistently? And if you do approach the dock and see a tall figure waiting on a barge that should not exist, remember my warning. The choice may seem to be yours, but the crossing, once begun, cannot be undone. The ferryman is patient. He has all the time in the world. And sooner or later, we all must cross. Have you ever heard the sound of footsteps when you're absolutely certain you're alone? That soft, deliberate pace that could be an animal, could be the wind, but somehow isn't? I have. in the woods of Wildcat Den State Park in eastern Iowa. And I'm still not sure exactly what was following me that night, only that it wanted something I wasn't prepared to give. I never planned to stay after dark. I'm a botanist, specializing in endangered woodland plants, and I'd spent the day documenting the rare species that grow in the microclimate of Wildcat Den sandstone formations. The park is known for its unusual geology, massive sandstone bluffs carved by prehistoric rivers, creating caves, crevices, and overhangs that support plant life found nowhere else in the region. It was meant to be a straightforward research trip. Arrive at dawn, take samples and photographs throughout the day, then return to my hotel in Muscatine by evening. But science, like nature, rarely follows our careful plans. I've been particularly focused on a stand of rare ferns growing in the damp recesses of a rock formation locals call the Devil's Punch Bowl, an apt name for the circular depression worn into the sandstone by millennia of water erosion. I lost track of time, and when I finally checked my watch, I was alarmed to discover it was already past 6. In October, that meant dusk was rapidly approaching. I packed my equipment quickly and started back toward the main trail. I ventured quite deep into the park, following my botanical interests rather than the marked paths. But I had a good sense of direction and wasn't particularly concerned. Even if full darkness fell, I had a headlamp and a fully charged phone with GPS. What I hadn't anticipated was the speed with which the storm would arrive. The day had been overcast but dry, with no indication of the deluge that was about to descend. One moment I was hiking briskly through dense woodland. The next, the sky opened as if someone had appended a celestial bucket. Within seconds, I was soaked to skin. Worse, the sudden downpour transformed the forest floor from merely damp to treacherously slick. The fallen leaves that crunched pleasantly underfoot all day now formed a slippery carpet over increasingly muddy ground. I slowed my pace, using my trekking pole for balance as I navigated the rapidly deteriorating conditions. The fading daylight, combined with the thick forest canopy and curtained rain, created a premature twilight that made it difficult to distinguish features in the landscape. After about 20 minutes of careful progress, I realized I had made a critical error. The landmarks I had been using to navigate back to the main trail were now obscured by rain and gathering darkness. I was still in Wildcat Den, certainly. The park isn't large enough to truly get lost in, but I was no longer confident in my precise location or the most direct route back to the car park. I stopped, sheltering under the broad leaves of a sycamore tree while I retrieved my phone to check the GPS. The screen illuminated, showing familiar blue to my position, but without the expected map surrounding it. Just a blank gray screen with my solitaire marker in the center. No signal, no map data loaded. Useless. I wasn't panicking yet. The park is only about 400 acres, bounded by roads and the Mississippi River. Even in the worst-case scenario, I'd eventually hit a boundary if I maintained a consistent direction. I switched on my headlamp, oriented myself using the slope of the land. The park generally descends toward the river to the east, and continued walking. The rain intensified, driven now by a gusting wind that bent the trees and sent cascades of water from the canopy above. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and occasional flashes of lightning briefly illuminated the forest in stark blue-white relief. It was during one of these flashes that I first noticed a structure, deep in what should have been uninhabited woodland. A dark shape loomed among the trees, too angular, too regular to be natural. When darkness returned, I directed my headlamp toward where I'd seen it. The beam caught what appeared to be the corner of a building, weathered timber silvered with age. This was unexpected. Wildcat Den has a historic grist mill and a few maintenance structures, but they're clustered near the main entrance, not deep in the woods where I now found myself. Curious, and hoping it might provide both shelter and a landmark to orient myself, I headed toward it. As I drew closer, the building revealed itself to be a cabin, small but solidly built, with a steep pitched roof and a single window visible from my approach. No light showed inside, and the structure had a distinctly abandoned air about it. The wood siding weathered to a uniform gray, patches of moss growing on the north-facing wall. I circled around to what proved to be the front, where a small porch sheltered a door hanging slightly ajar. This was luck beyond what I dared hope for. Not only shelter from the storm, but possibly a park ranger station or maintenance builder with a radio or a landline. "Hello," I called, loud enough to be heard over the rain drumming on the roof. "Anyone there?" "Park ranger." No response. I stepped onto the porch, the aged boards creaking beneath my weight, and called again. Still nothing. I hesitated at the threshold. Entering an unknown building in the middle of the woods during a storm had all the hallmarks of horror movie's inciting incident. But the rational part of my brain reminded me that this was almost certainly a park structure of some kind. And even if it was private property, surely the owners would understand the necessity of seeking shelter in such conditions. I pushed the door open wider and directed my headlamp inside. The cabin consisted of a single room, perhaps 15 feet square. It contained sparse furnishings, a small table with 2 chairs, a cast iron stove in one corner, a narrow bed frame against the far wall. No mattress, no bedding, no personal items or decorations of any kind. Just the bare bones of habitation, as if someone had removed everything but the heaviest furniture. Most importantly, it was dry and empty of any other occupants, human or animal. I stepped inside, relieved to be out of the downpour, and closed the door behind me. The sudden cessation of the rain's noise created an odd pocket of silence. I could still hear it beating against the roof and walls, but it was muffled now, distant. The air inside the cabin was cool and surprisingly fresh, without the musty odor I would have expected from an abandoned structure. I set my backpack on the table and extracted a towel to dry my face and hands. Then I took the opportunity to properly examine my surroundings. The cabin appeared to be very old, but well maintained. The logs forming the walls were hand-hewn, the chinking between them solid and unmottled. The floorboards, though worn smooth by generations of feet, showed no signs of rot. The single window was intact, its glass cloudy with age but unbroken. The only incongruous element was a stove, which looked far newer than its surroundings, a modern cast-iron model rather than antique. Curious, I approached it. The metal was cold to the touch, with no signs of recent use, but there was a small stack of split wood beside it, neatly arranged and perfectly dry. The rational explanation was that this was indeed a park building, perhaps maintained as a historical exhibit or emergency shelter. But if so, why was it on the park map? And why were there no signs, no informational placards, nothing to indicate its official status? I was pondering these questions, debating whether to light the stove to dry my sodden clothes, when I heard a soft sound outside, barely audible over the rain. Footsteps approaching the cabin. Relief washed over me. Another hiker caught in the storm, perhaps, or a park ranger making rounds even in this weather. I moved to the door, ready to explain my presence, but something stopped me from opening it immediately. Some primitive instinct that recognized the wrongness in those footsteps before my conscious mind could articulate it. They were too measured, too deliberate. Not the hurried pace of someone seeking shelter from rain, but the unhurried tread of someone who knew exactly where they were going and felt no discomfort from the elements. I stood frozen, listening as the footsteps ascended the porch steps. 1, 2, 3, and stopped directly outside the door. No knock followed. No call hello or anyone in there. Just silence, as if whoever or whatever stood on the other side was listening as intently as I was. The moment stretched, unbearable in its tension. I found myself holding my breath, irrationally certain that the slightest sound would trigger something irreversible. Finally, a knock came, 3 soft taps, so gentle they might have been raindrops if not for the precise rhythm. I remained silent, my heart hammering so loudly in my chest, I was certain it must be audible from outside. 3 more taps, slightly firmer this time. "I know you're in there," came a voice, soft, almost musical, neither distinctly male nor female. "I can smell the outside on you." My blood ran cold. The phrasing, the outside, struck me as fundamentally wrong, as if being outdoors was an aberration rather than the natural state of the forest. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. "A traveler like yourself," the voice replied, "caught in the rain. Won't you let me in?" Every childhood warning, every folk tale, every horror story I'd ever encountered screamed in my mind. "Do not invite it in." "I'm sorry," I said, attempting to sound regretful but firm. "The cabin's really small, barely room for me. There must be another shelter nearby." A soft sound came from the other side of the door. It might have been a laugh, though it held no mirth. "There is not," the voice said, "and the storm grows worse. Surely you wouldn't leave a fellow wanderer to the mercies of the night? That would be unkind." The way it hesitated before the final word sent a shiver down my spine, as if unkind was a translation of something far worse in its native vocabulary. Perhaps we could share knowledge instead of shelter. It continued when I didn't respond. "You've been studying the green things, the growing things. I saw you earlier with your little bags and boxes, taking pieces of the forest with you. It had been watching me all day as I worked alone, believing myself unobserved. This person had been following, observing. I'm a botanist," I said, unsure why I was explaining myself to the unsettling presence on the other side of the door. "I'm studying endangered plants for conservation." "Conservation," it repeated, as if tasting an unfamiliar word. "Keeping safe what belongs to the forest." "Yes, I understand this. I too am a conservator of sorts." A sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin, and I heard the rain intensify, now a roaring deluge rather than a steady downpour. "The storm brings the darkness early tonight," the voice said, now barely audible over the tempest. "And there are things abroad that even I avoid when night and storm coincide in these woods. Last chance, botanist. Let me in." There was a subtle shift in its tone, the pretense of politeness falling away, revealing something ancient and cold beneath. "I can't," I said, no longer caring if it heard the fear in my voice. "Please go away." Silence followed, so prolonged that I began to hope it had indeed left. Then, so close it must have been speaking to the crack, where a door met frame, it whispered, "When the water rises and the old ways open, when what sleeps beneath the stone awakens, you'll wish you made a friend of me instead of them." The footsteps receded, 3 steps down from the porch, then fading into the sound of rain. I stood motionless, straining to hear any indication that it lingered nearby. But there was nothing. I should have felt relief. Instead, its parting words had left me with a growing sense of dread. What did it mean about water rising? About old ways opening? I moved to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever had been at the door. But the glass showed only darkness and the silver streaks of rain illuminated by my headlamp's reflection. I had no intention of leaving the relative safety of the cabin. Storm or no storm, I decided to make the best of the situation, to light the stove, dry my clothes as much as possible, and wait out the worst of the weather. I knelt by the stove and carefully arranged kindling from the woodpile, then added a few of the smaller logs. I found matches in my emergency kit, and soon had a small but cheerful fire going. The warmth was immediate and welcome, dispelling some of the chill that had settled into my bones. both from the rain and from the unsettling encounter. As the cabin gradually warmed, I began to notice things I'd overlooked in my initial inspection. Markings carved into the logs near the ceiling. Not English letters, but symbols I didn't recognize. A pattern in the floorboards that became apparent as my damp footprints dried. Concentric circles radiating from the center of the room. And most disturbingly, what I had taken to be dark knots in the wooden door now resolved into small, carefully bored holes that I leveled, as if someone had wanted to observe the cabin's interior without being seen. I was contemplating these discoveries, trying to construct a rational explanation, when I heard a new sound beneath the storm's continuing fury, a gurgling, bubbling noise coming from beneath the floorboards. I directed my headlamp toward the sound. Water was seeping up between the floorboards near the center of the room, forming a growing puddle exactly in the middle of those concentric circles I'd noticed. This was alarming, but not immediately threatening. The cabin was old, probably didn't have proper foundations. The torrential rain had saturated the ground, and now groundwater was finding its way up to the floor. Unpleasant, but not supernatural. I maintained this rational explanation right up until the moment the water began to move against gravity. Instead of spreading naturally across the floor, the puddle remained contained within the innermost circle. Then, defying all physical laws, it began to climb upward, forming a column of water that rose toward the ceiling. I scrambled backward until my shoulders hit the wall, watching in horrified fascination as the water column took shape. It grew to about 4 feet tall, then began to undulate, its surface rippling as it disturbed from within, and then it opened its eyes. Not human eyes, not even animal eyes, just darker patches within the water that somehow conveyed the unmistakable sense of being watched, being evaluated. One pair, then another and another, until the column bristled with these eyeless gazes. A sound emerged from it, not a voice speaking through air, but something felt rather than heard, vibrating in my bones and teeth. You are not the offering we expected. My mouth worked silently for a moment before I found my voice. Offering. The water column undulated, those dark patches blinking in unsettling asynchrony. The cabin keeper brings us travelers, wanderers, lost souls who won't be missed. You were be tonight's gift. Understanding crashed over me like a wave. The voice at the door, the conservator, it hadn't been seeking shelter. It had been trying to leave before this arrived. I'm not an offering, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm a botanist from the university. People know where I am. The vibration came again, this time with a sensation I can only describe as amusement. Do they? In this storm, on these unmarked paths? We think not. The water column surged forward, not flowing across the floor, but moving as a single entity, maintaining its vaguely humanoid shape. I pressed harder against the wall, seeing now that the carved symbols around the ceiling's perimeter were glowing with a faint blue-white light, the same color as the lightning that still flashed outside. The old bargain stands. The water thing vibrated, a life for the waters, to keep the drought at bay, to protect the green things you so carefully study. It was now close enough that I could feel its unnatural coolness radiating against my skin. Not the normal coolness of water, but something deeper, older, the cold of underground rivers that have never seen sunlight. If the cabin keepers fail to provide, then you will serve instead. It reached for me, not with a hand, but with a tendril of water that extended from its main mass. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only watch as it stretched toward my face. The door burst open with a crash that momentarily drowned out even the storm's fury. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the night, was a figure I recognized instantly as the owner of the voice that had spoken to me earlier. In the brief illumination of lightning, I caught a glimpse of something not quite human. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at odd angles and fingers that extended into tapered points like branches. Its face remained in shadow, but I had the impression of eyes that reflected light, like an animal's, and a mouth set in a grimace that revealed too many teeth. "This one is not for you," it said, its musical voice now hard authority. "This one knows the green things, tends them, preserves them. The old bargain does not apply to the forest friends." The water column seemed to hesitate, its eyeless gazes shifting from me to the newcomer. The drought comes, it vibrated, the sensation now tinged what felt like desperation. "The stones grow dry. We must have what was promised." "And you shall," the figure in the doorway replied. "But not this one. This one must leave now, while the way remains open." It turned those reflecting eyes toward me. "Come, botanist, quickly. The waters are rising, and once the old ways open fully, neither of us will be able to leave this place until dawn." I hesitated, caught between two impossible choices. The water thing that had explicitly expressed its intention to kill me, and an inhuman figure that had, at least, argued for my release. Another flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, and I saw the water column growing, expanding, more of those dark eye spots forming within its rippling surface. The floorboard were now completely submerged, water bubbling up with increasing force. I made my decision and lunged for the door, snatching my backpack from the table as I passed. The figure stepped aside to let me through, then followed me onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind us. The rain was still falling heavily, but with less violence than before. In the distance, thunder rumbled, suggesting the storm was moving away. What was that thing? I gasped, still trying to process what I witnessed. "Something old," my unlikely rescuer replied. "Something that was here before the trees, before the stones. It sleeps beneath the river most of the time, but when the storms come and the waters rise, it can reach inland through the underground streams." I turned to look at him, her, it, in the dim light of my headlamp. I could see it more clearly than before, and my scientific mind struggled to categorize what I was seeing. It had the general shape of a human, but was composed of what appeared to be plant matter, bark-like skin, limbs that resembled gnarled branches, hair that hung in tendrils reminiscent of Spanish moss. "And what are you?" I asked, unable to keep the tremor from my voice. It made that sound again and not quite laugh. "Something nearly as old, but of the forest rather than the water. A keeper of balances. A conservator, as I told you. You were going to feed me to that thing," I said, anger briefly overcoming fear. It tilted its head at an angle no human neck could achieve. "I was seeking someone to serve as the offering, yes. But when I saw what you were, a tender of plants, a catalog of green life, I decided you were more valuable left alive." It paused, those reflecting eyes studying me. "I tried to warn you away from the cabin. It's a focal point, a place where the old bargain is fulfilled when the waters rise." "What bargain?" "Water for the forest in times of drought, in exchange for the occasional traveler. An arrangement older than your kind's memory." It gestured toward the cabin. "That building marks the spot where the exchange has been made for centuries. The symbols channel and contain the water's emissary until the offering is made." I thought of the symbols carved around the ceiling, the concentric circles in the floor. Who built it? My kind, initially. Your kind, later, not understanding but following the patterns they found. Maintaining the old ways without knowing why. It looked up at the sky, where the clouds were beginning to break apart, revealing patches of star-filled darkness. "The storm passes. You should go now. Follow me, and I will lead you back to your car place." I hesitated. Following this creature through the dark woods seemed only marginally safer than facing the water thing in the cabin. But I was hopelessly lost, and dawn was hours away. Why should I trust you? I asked, It turned those inhuman eyes on me again, because I could have left you in there, or taken you myself, as I have taken others before you. But instead, I argued for your life. It extended one of those branch-like hands, the fingers tapering to points that looked sharp enough to pierce skin. And because if you do not leave these woods tonight, the water one will find you again. Its hunger has been woken, and it will not easily return to its slumber unfed. Put that way, I had little choice. I nodded, and it turned, moving into the trees with fluid grace that belied its seemingly rigid composition. I followed, my headlamp illuminating a path that I swear hadn't been there earlier in the day, a clear track through the underbrush that led steadily downhill. We walked in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The rain gradually lessened to a drizzle, then stopped altogether. Finally, we emerged from the tree line, and I saw with profound relief the small car park where I had left my vehicle that morning. It was empty save for my car, gleaming wetly under the emerging stars. The plant creature stopped at the edge of the woods. This is where we part ways, botanists. A piece of wisdom, freely given. Do not return to Wildcat Den after dark, especially not when rain is in the forecast. I nodded, too exhausted and overwhelmed to formulate a proper response. As I started toward my car, its voice stopped me one last time. The samples you collected today, the rare ferns from the Devil's Punch Bowl, you should destroy them. I turned back. Why? They're endangered species, important for research. Its face shifted in what might have been a smile on a human countenance, but on its wooden features looked like a crack widening. They are endangered for a reason. Those plants grow only in places where the boundary between worlds is thin. They feed on energies your science cannot yet measure. In your laboratories, under your artificial lights, they will change, become something else, something hungry. With that cryptic warning, it stepped backward into the trees and was gone, not walking away, but simply ceasing to be visible, as if it had become one with the forest. I drove back to my hotel in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd experienced. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat up until dawn, watching the rain-streaked window and jumping at every tap of branch against glass. The next morning, I found myself standing in the hotel bathroom, staring at the samples I'd so carefully collected the day before. In the harsh fluorescent light, they looked perfectly ordinary, just delicate ferns with an unusual growth pattern. Yet I couldn't shake the wooden creature's warning. In the end, I left them on the bathroom counter, not destroyed, but also not taken back to my university lab. Some other botanist, some other day, would have to document the rare species of Wildcat Denver. I'd suddenly lost my scientific curiosity about them. I've not returned to that part of Iowa since. My colleagues were disappointed by my lack of samples, but accepted my explanation of equipment damaged by the unexpected storm. I told no one about the cabin or what I'd encountered there. Who would believe me? But sometimes on rainy nights like tonight, I find myself checking the soil moisture of my houseplants more carefully than usual. And if I notice them growing in unusual patterns or too quickly, I don't hesitate to prune them back. Are you listening to this in the rain? Is there a plant nearby? Its leaves perhaps turn slightly in your direction despite the absence of sunlight to seek. Look closely at the soil it grows in. Is it perhaps a bit too wet, given when you last watered it? And that tap at your window, are you certain it's just a branch moved by the wind? I'm not anymore, because now I understand that conservation works both ways. We may study and protect the wild things, but they, too, are watching us, evaluating us, deciding whether we're worth preserving or whether we might serve some other purpose in their ancient, incomprehensible bargains. And in those moments between storm and calm, between daylight and darkness, the boundaries between their world and ours grow thin indeed.